Hi, if you're an impact investor, I'd like you to ask yourself, how confident are you that your impact metrics on the enterprises you invest in actually indicate the impact that they're having? If you're like many impact investors, you probably suspect that your metrics can often be misleading. Today in this talk, we are going to discuss the mismeasure of impact and what impact investors might do instead. My name is Ken Scheffler. I'm a director at Innovations for Poverty Action, and I'm joined by my colleague, Laura Castro, who is an advisor with IPA. Today, we're hoping to leave you with two main takeaways. One is that as you look to assess the impact of your investees, you should only do so through rigorous evaluations. We should not rely on sort of naive, what we call naive before and after evaluations that don't really get at whether impact is being achieved. The second major takeaway is that as an impact investor, you can and probably should be supporting your investees in implementing path-based measurement. The measurement activities that the enterprises you invest in should not be the same if they're in the seed stage as they are if they're the late maturation stage. With that, I'll turn it over to Lara, who will talk more about who we are and the importance of rigorous evaluation.
Thank you, Ken. So as Ken was saying, both him and I work at Innovations for Poverty Action, also known as IPA. IPA studies what works and what doesn't work in global development, and we hope to share it with policymakers to influence decision making. We've been around for around 20 years. We have 21 offices around the world, and we have conducted more than 900 impact evaluation studies in partnerships with real-world implementers and academic researchers from top universities. Within IPA, Ken and I work in a specific unit called the Right with Evidence Unit. And our mission is to support social sector organizations being smarter producers and users of data and evidence so that you can make better decisions. We are now 4 years old. We're a young and growing unit. We have around 25 staff around the world, and we have now completed around 50 engagements. We have been very pleased to see all of the progress that the impact investing community has made in measuring and managing impact. For example, we have seen multiple initiatives focused on measuring impact through the Impact Management Project or establishing standard metrics like the IRIS Plus project, and even monetizing impact through the B-Impact assessment. Today, we'd like to contribute to this conversation by sharing our approach to supporting social sector organizations, measuring impact, and learning how to continue learning iteratively, which we think is complementary to the frameworks and principles that are already being established in the impact investing community. So to kick things off, we want to ask you a question. Here we have a chart that shows the data from different studies done in different countries for employability programs. An employability program is a training usually focused on youth, aimed at getting them skills so they can upgrade their jobs or find a job. And so in this chart, we can see the difference. So mostly the increase, but in the case of Kenya, the decrease in the employment rates before and after the training program. So the numbers are based on the percentage of people that were employed after the program compared to the percentage of people that were employed at the beginning. So based on this data, I want you to think at home, which program do you think had a biggest impact? And we're going to come back to that to give you the real answer. But first, we need to agree on what we mean by impact. So when we think about impact, we really want you to think about what you would answer if your mom or your aunt or your cousin asked you, well, what's the impact of your job? And generally, we think most people would answer something that includes difference. So when we talk about impact, we talk about the difference that you're making. And that means talking about what would not have happened if you were to be involved in that scenario. So in this specific case, when we talk about impact, we talk about the change in outcomes for those affected by a program or a service or a business, compared to the outcomes that would have happened, that we would have seen if this service wasn't offered. So in the previous slide, we had shown you the before and after employment rates in different countries for an employability program. This indicates how participants were doing after the program, but that doesn't indicate the impact, because it doesn't allow us to isolate the effect that the training program had in these people's lives. In other words, we're not able to see what would have happened if they hadn't attended the training program. And that's really what we're interested about. To do that, we can try to estimate those outcomes by using what we call a control group, which is a group of individuals that are statistically similar to the original group, but did not attend the program. So we're gonna exemplify this through this graph. Here we see the rate of employment before the program, and then we see what happens during the intervention, and we see that there is a very clear increase in rates. So if you didn't know about counterfactuals, you might say to yourself, well, this difference between the rate after and the rate before is my impact. And this is what we would call a naive impact. Why? Because it doesn't isolate the effect that the training program had from other kinds of variables that can affect people's lives. So for example, if you're looking for a job, maybe you go to this training program, but maybe also you ask your friends, or maybe you get some help from some government agency, and you don't know if this final employment rate was due to the training program or to something else. What we can do instead is get a control group. So if you can help me, thank you. So here we have what we call the naive impact. And then now, if you get a counterfactual, what you can do is see the difference between what would have happened if the training program wasn't offered versus what happened now. And that allows you to see the true impact, or the counterfactual impact. And as you can see, this true impact often is different from the naive impact. And often it is also much smaller, because there are many other things that affect people's lives beyond the program that you offer them, or the business, the product that the business is offering. And so now, to get to the real answer to the question that we asked before, we will show you the chart that shows the real impact of these programs. So the blue bars is what we showed you before. They're the before and after calculations. So that's what we would call the naive impact. And the red bars are the real impact. These are the difference in employment rates from the people that went to a training program compared to employment rates at the same moment in time from the people that didn't go to a training program. So this allows us to account for all of the other variables that in that period of time were affecting the employment rates of these individuals. And as you can see, they're quite different. Originally, when we showed you the before and after bars, you might have said that this program in the Dominican Republic was the one that had the highest impact, but in fact, as we can see here, it was the one in Argentina, the one that had highest impact. And these results are not correlated at all, which means that even if you understand that counterfactual impact is a true measure of impact, you might believe that the before and after gives you some sort of estimation or proxy, but that is not true. As you can see, there are very large bars, like the first program in the Dominican Republic that had a huge before and after effect, but actually the impact was tiny. And this is easy to understand intuitively when you talk about employment programs, because some people have a better profile to be employed than others. And those people who are more motivated, who have done more things, might also be the ones seeking out a training program. So that means that regardless of your program or not, they had a better profile, and so they would get a job much more easily. While other groups, for example, formerly incarcerated people, they have a much harder time finding a job, which means that at the end of the program, maybe your employment rate will be really low. Maybe you only managed to get a job for 1 out of 4 people, 25%. But without your program, maybe only 5% of those would have gotten a job. So your impact is going to be much larger, because the difference that you're making in people's lives is going to be much larger. So what does this tell us? This tells us that rigorous impact evaluations are really the core to high quality measurement. And I should mention that we have also done this analysis for other areas beyond employment, such as education and agriculture, and we find exactly the same relationship because there are various factors that contribute to the change there. So in agriculture, you can have different rain patterns or price fluctuations. And in education, well, you have children who learn through interactions with their peers, through interactions with their parents. And so it's very hard to isolate the contribution of the business or service. So this is why impact evaluations are very important. Rigorous impact evaluations are almost the only way to provide an accurate and reliable measure of the effect size and contribution of a business on the real final outcomes that you care about. And these results are really not intuitive. When you incorporate also cost in the equation, you can have some programs that are 20 times as cost effective as others, even if at face value, maybe they were not that impactful. But if they're cheap interventions, then maybe they would bring a very large return on investment. So whether or not you or the companies are able to do impact evaluations, it can really make a huge difference once you study it to make correct investment decisions. And in fact, the cost of not doing an impact evaluation can sometimes be much larger than the actual cost of doing it, because you're avoiding investing in a lot of businesses that might not have the returns in terms of impact and cost effectiveness that you might be expecting. And it's like making an investment while being blind about the actual outcomes that you're expecting to see. So this is why our first takeaway that we wanted to leave you with is that to assess impact, you need to do so through rigorous evaluations. Otherwise, you might as well not do it at all, because you would be making investment decisions based on incorrect information that are not correlated with the actual measure of impact that we all care about. But we understand that sometimes that's not feasible. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ken to share why we have the second takeaway of alternative metrics of ways of learning that you can use when an impact evaluation is not the right fit.
Thanks, Laura. So to reiterate what you've said, it's important that impact investors evaluate impact through rigorous evaluations. And this is similar to the concept that you find in impact investing of contribution. We also think it's quite important for impact investors to support investees in implementing what we call path-based measurement. Part of the reason why path-based measurement is important is because rigorous impact evaluations are not always the right answer. They may be inappropriate if it's not the right time. For example, very early in an organization's development, it doesn't make sense to evaluate them for impact. They're not likely to have an impact, their model at that point, and their model may change. So it's not worth the investment early on. It also might not be worth the investment later on. After you've scaled, it may be, in a sense, already too late. You should have proven the impact case before they went to full scale. It could be that an impact evaluation is not appropriate because it's not feasible. For example, to do a proper, rigorous evaluation, you often want to randomize. That's not always possible due to ethical reasons or to other reasons based on the unit of analysis. It's just not feasible to randomize at times. And then finally, impact evaluations can be costly. Laura pointed out that there is a cost to not doing impact evaluations, and that you may be investing things unwisely. That said, it doesn't make sense to constantly be doing rigorous impact evaluations. It's better to be strategic about your investments and do impact evaluations at the right time when there's high feasibility. So what should impact investors be pushing their investees to do instead of just evaluations? I've talked about path-based measurement, and I'll explain that more in just a minute. But before I do, I wanted to share with you as an example two programs that aimed at improving educational outcomes and the different paths that they took. So the first program is called One Laptop Per Child. And this was at one point a promising initiative. In 2005, it was announced at a UN gala with Kofi and Annan. And the idea was to manufacture laptops that had high functionality, could enable students to use them to learn, and were also quite affordable. So $100 per student. And this was something that the one laptop per child, people just thought was like intuitively open and shut case. In fact, the founder, who is a professor at MIT, said, this is not something you have to test. The day of pilot projects are over. So there's a real emphasis on getting to scale quickly. And as you can see in their first 2 years, they had already reached 600,000 children with laptops. In contrast, a second program that actually was initially started a few years earlier, back in 1998, is called Teaching at the Right Level, and they took a bit of a slower approach. So their first implementation activities of Teaching at the Right Level were in 1998, and by 2001, they were just active in 20 schools in India at that point. And in fact, despite the fact that they had done a lot of expensive and painful measurement, they found nothing. They didn't find that they were having any impact. And so one like at home, again, self-test question is, which of these ended up with greater scale and greater impact? I could leave you a second to think what your answer. You probably see where this is going, but let me share the results one by one. So with one laptop per child, they ultimately reached at least 3 million people, and the cost ended up being a bit higher once you add in organizational expenses. But you can see the third row is really where the rubber hits the road. Rigorous impact evaluation was conducted in 2012, and it found that there was actually no impact on learning. There's actually interesting findings from that. So students used the laptop and they got good at using the apps on the laptop, but it didn't translate into gains in math and literacy. So they scaled fast. They, as you can see in the headline, they were not ultimately as successful. They lost to failing fast. So teaching at the right level, despite the fact that teaching at the right level was a quote unquote failure in its first few years, ultimately it got things right. By now it's reached approximately 60 million people at a cost of $2 to $15 per student. They're in many different locations, so costs will vary. And the impact on learning based on rigorous impact evaluations is estimated to be 3 learning adjusted years of schooling per $100. That means that for every $100 invested in teaching at the right level, it results in students catching up by 3 grade levels. So teaching at the right level is really an exceptional success story, for the educational sector. And it's worth looking at it a little bit further to see what general lessons one can draw. And what we see here is actually a long timeline. As I mentioned, it starts in 1998 when Pratham, the organization that first implemented Teach at the Right Level, started thinking about it. They were doing just like prototypes. And originally the idea was that you needed to reduce the teacher to student, you need to increase the teacher to student ratio. And in their initial pilots, they found that actually that didn't lead to any promising results. So then, they spoke with teachers, they spoke with students, they really understood their context and the problem. And they pivoted to a new model, which was testing students early on and sorting them together based on their educational capabilities, their competency levels, not their age. And so once they did that, students were at the right level. They had catch-up sessions, and that actually proved to be quite successful in enabling educational gains. So that might just be the end of the story, but you can see there's quite a bit further RCTs. These are randomized controlled trials. They're the type of evaluation that Lauder described, where you have a control group. And the point, I guess, one point to draw from this is that even when you've landed on something that seems to be high impact, your experimentation shouldn't end there. Like as you go to adapt to new contexts, you want to engage in the same type of activities as from the start. So that includes piloting, prototyping, doing randomized control trials, and doing ongoing monitoring to ensure that your implementation is going as planned. And so by now, as I mentioned earlier, they've reached 60 million students, and they're in they've been integrated into educational programs in Africa and Latin America, in addition to where they started in India. So from that example of an organization that got it right, I'd like to kind of take you through IPA's thinking on more generally what social enterprises can be doing to measure and learn in a way that provides information that investors need and also enables them to be better, higher impact performers. I'll start out here with sort of a typical model. We have the stages that you are likely familiar with. They're not always called this, but they're usually pretty similar terms of pre-seed, seed, early stage, mid stage, and late stage. At IDA, we similarly refer to these stages as ideation, refinement, proof, adaptation, and scaling. And I guess one overall point is that an organization that is in the ideation stage should be doing things that are quite different when it comes to monitoring and other learning aimed activities than an organization in the late stage or the scaling stage. And we, in the next few slides, map out these different things that we suggest make sense based on path-based measurement. So in the pre-seed stage or the ideation stage, here the idea, as you probably suspect, is really pretty to answer high-level questions. You want the organizations, enterprises to identify challenges. What is the problem they're seeking to solve? Understand users. If this is market-driven, obviously you want them to be thinking about like business cases, value proposition, this sort of thing. And measurement activities, there's a lot of potential ones, but it's looking more at things that are related to understanding the environment as opposed to understanding the performance of the individual enterprise. So there's some activities to include literature reviews and user testing. You can see there's a box here with metrics and it says not applicable. So in the ideation stage, there are a few quantitative investee performance metrics that are going to be meaningful. They're just really not, they may be prototyping things at that point, but really sharing quantitative metrics at that point won't tell you if they're learning, if they have a good viable model. So more important is that they understand the problem and the users. So moving to the next stage, the seed/refinement stage, here the objective should be to assess the execution quality and identify early signals of success or failure. So this would involve businesses piloting their programs and monitoring. And here there's a variety of metrics that can be used to see if implementation/execution is going as planned, and if there are early signals of success. One is to see if there's take up of the product or the service. So if you're offering an employability course, are people attending? If you're selling something, are people buying what you're selling? Early outcomes. So in the case, again, of the employability example, this could be to see if they score well in a comprehension test on topics taught. This is different from them going on to get a job. there's going to be a lot of other factors involved there, a lot of reasons for variability that raise attribution issues. But when it comes to whether or not they comprehended what was taught, that's something that's quite easy to test, and you could also attribute it to the program. So this is a good time to do that. And then finally, user feedback. This can take the form of quantitative. This can take quantitative or qualitative forms. One common quantitative form is the Net Promoter Score. So in the refinement stage, long lists of required metrics can actually stymie innovation. You don't want enterprises to be focused on doing meaningless measurement. Metrics that are specific to the business are more meaningful often than standard metrics. So, I know that there are in the impact investment world, like a lot of standardized metrics by sector, and those can be quite helpful, especially in the later stages. But at this stage, those metrics often are related to final outcomes. And at this stage, it's important to ensure that the earlier stage things are happening, like implementation is occurring, and that the intended beneficiaries / the intended users are actually getting like the early outcomes out of it. So moving to the middle stage, which is often called the early stage in impact investment world, we call it the proof stage. And here, quite simply, this is the right time to demonstrate impact. So this may be when enterprise is, it can occur at various points. There's a lot of context specificity in making these determinations, but often it could occur between year 2 and year 5, when business or an enterprise has established itself, it knows its implementation is occurring as planned. It has an established model, and it now wants to see if that model is leading to the final outcomes it hopes to achieve. So at this stage, we'd recommend doing a rigorous impact evaluation. For final outcomes, there's so many different ones, and there's a lot of great resources on the potential final outcomes. I guess keeping with the employment training example here, we wrote that a metric for that would be a change in the employment rate of the treatment group minus the change in the employment rate of the control group. So then moving to the later stages of the path, in the mid stage or the adaptation stage, the objective should be to test the applicability of the model to new contexts and to test the effectiveness of design adaptations within the new context. So the measurement activities here are going to look similar to measurement activities in the ideation stage, because in a sense, you're going through that same process over again, just in a new context. So this could involve user testing, and also piloting with associated monitoring of metrics. And again, we see the same metrics here as before. Testing in the adaptation stage is business and context specific, and the most appropriate measurement activities and metrics will vary depending on what are the key unknowns surrounding that enterprise and surrounding the new context that it's in. So finally, moving to the late stage or the scale stage, here the enterprise and you as an impact investor should feel pretty confident in the model, because you've already done rigorous impact evaluation, hopefully in the proof stage. You've already done some user testing and other measurements in the adaptation stage to see if to see how the service or product works in a new context. So at this stage, you could just do ongoing monitoring. So this again could look like product service take-up, early outcomes. At this point, evidence of high quality implementation is sufficient because the evidence of impact has already been established. That said, it could be the case that because the contexts are so different, new questions are raised, and therefore there can be a case made in sometimes for impact evaluations to occur again. And if you remember the example from teaching at the right level, you saw that they actually had 6 different impact evaluations during that period as they scaled. So it's not to say that impact evaluations should only occur in the proof stage, but generally as you move to scale, enterprises feel more confident in what they're doing and the results they're achieving, and there's often less of a need for an impact evaluation. So getting back to our 2 takeaways, Laura talked earlier about the importance of assessing impact through rigorous evaluations. And I've talked about supporting investees in implementing path-based measurement. Part of the responsibility for doing these activities falls onto the investees themselves, but impact investors have a lot of power. You can, in some cases, insist on some metrics to be collected. You could also potentially use that power to influence investees to do things like more prototyping, more user testing, these sorts of things. A bit more about our unit in Innovations for Poverty Action before we close. We tend to work with organizations in a couple of different ways. One is through design and planning activities, and the other is through partnerships. With design and planning, we tend to come in and work on workshops for investors and organizations that don't have a measurement plan in place or don't have a plan for supporting their investees or their grantees with their measurement. So we can help them in doing that through workshops. Also under design and planning, over a few months, we can do diagnostics. So find out, like, what are you learning right now? What are you asking of investees? And doing some assessments as to, is the learning activities, is the learning that you're gathering and the activities that you're recommending leading to the results that you hope to? And then make recommendations based on that. And then finally, the partnership side, that could take a lot of forms. We offer technical assistance based on our understanding of monitoring, evaluation, and more generally learning. We have communities of practice that we run with groups of grantees or groups of investees. And we're really willing to roll up our sleeves and figure out what's most needed and provide tailored support. So this, hopefully this resonates to some extent. We'd love to hear feedback on this if it's of interest. What we've said, if you have any sort of concerns about this, you have any questions about how it could work with your firm, please feel free to reach out to us to continue the conversation. We've listed here the Loic Boatine, who's a director of Right Fit Evidence, and myself, and I'd be happy to speak with all of you. We really think that there's a lot of potential in impact investing, and that impact investors are in a unique vantage point to influence how enterprises do things. So we'd love to discuss with you ways we could help investors be more impactful through their measurement and learning activities. Thanks for staying to the end of this recording.